today's podcast, we're going to be talking about video games and culture. We're going to be talking about a few different issues that apply to that, and show how it really doesn't, all the different aspects that really apply to that. And the first aspect we're going to be going is trying to dispute the fact that there's some link to this violent video games, and the ability for people to take it and become these shooters. And the fact is that there's some reason that there's more deaths because of these games, and that's the reason why we're finding this in such things as school shootings. Now, even though we see the high number of school shootings, which looks fairly high, of 65, we need to understand a few things of what is happening with this. Number one is, if we're really from video games, they would probably be copying what's happening with these weapons in these first-person shooters. Number one. Number two is, why are they hitting specific places as schools? Well, one of the main things that makes schools unique is that they're listed as what we call a gun-free zone. This is something that, if you look at even most mass shootings, this is something that makes them very, very unique, is they're free of guns themselves, which makes the ability for defense to actually not exist. And this is something that is very, very important, as if there isn't an ability for any type of defense of a stand down to happen, that it makes it an easy target of basically shooting fish in a barrel, which is what the situation happens to be. Now, if they were really trying to replicate what they were seeing in a video game, wouldn't they just try to find other people that were armed and able to attack, not just attack unarmed victims? Now, if they were influenced by a video game, they would essentially be looking for people that were armed themselves. Why aren't they shooting at police officers or more often, and trying to invade areas like that? The reason why is because the fact is they're not influenced by video games. This is usually a case of mental illness itself that's a major cause, and they're essentially just hitting weak targets and nothing more. Most often it's a case of bullying from people in that school itself, and then or that's usually one of the cases. Like in the case of, I believe it was called Stoneman Douglas School, that was where one of Emma Gonzalez, who was one of the supposed victims, was actually one of the actual bullies of the shooter. Perpetrated herself as a victim, and yet she was really actually a major bully of the student. Yet she's being paraded. Yet she was paraded as an actual victim of the whole situation, and CNN actually made a town hall to actually parade her around and show her as a victim, when she was actually a catalyst to the actual event. And then we also see in the other situation, like in Columbine, where we had people jump to conclusions that it was about bullying when it was not. That was actually two people who actually were inspired by these serial killers and actually wanted to become famous, so they decided to create this elaborate plan and shoot up a school. But you had people like Michael Moore jumping to conclusions, claiming it was about bullying, and there was this whole big elaborate thing claiming that they were victims by the media. And they gave him awards for something that was essentially an elaborate hoax. And then then we had people trying to jump on the bandwagon, stating it was about violent video games. And if we look at video games, are nothing have done nothing of the case. If you look at video games, they should be a direct correlation with the way they're arranged. I mean, if you look at let's take a look at some of the stuff on Mortal Kombat Trilogy. This is one of the ones that was kind of through my later childhood, which kind of encompassed some of my earlier childhood, but some of my later childhood as well. And you'll see some of the, right here, you'll see some of the actual fatalities on it, and you'll see how more creative it was than anything else. And I'll show a few of them, but you'll see how creative it was more than anything else. I mean, you look at that. I mean, does that look like he's really ripping out the guy's heart? That Kano is really ripping Johnny Cage's heart out? No, it doesn't. And people, if they even dare try that, people can't throw lightning like Raiden can't. People don't have razors for hands and lop someone's head off. And again, they don't have lightning like Raiden does. I mean, this is a thing too, and people, even when I was growing up, were basically trying to state that Mortal Kombat was going to create people and make them violent. There's no razor hats out there. There might have been during some of the early ages of China, but as used as a military weapon. But the fact is it doesn't exist now. I mean, look at that. Sonya Blade with her kiss of death that basically causes someone to basically turn on fire. What, you're gonna really cause someone's gonna actually explode like Cyrex does? I mean, this is basically what we're talking about, and it's really something that's that these are things that are basically that they were actually freaking out about when I was growing up. And the major thing was on the MK1 was the blood code. Was how dare you spread around the blood code around school? If you knew the blood code, you were the coolest thing in the world, and it was what it called. You shouldn't be spreading it around school. Well, I was known for spreading around school. I just didn't tell anyone that I did it. But it was a joke with it because it didn't look real, and everyone knew it didn't look real because this is PlayStation 1 right here. You can tell, and the blood doesn't look real. Even with the blood where it looks real now with it, it's still, you can tell how with some of the newer games it's still quite humorous with how it looks. And if we go out to, I believe, let's get to some of the let's see if I can get to some of the brutalities. Which I skipped one. Yeah, right here. Here's a brutality. Yeah, showing us he's beating him up, but look at the number of body parts that's flying off with it. There's basically we're talking that there's the number of parts that are coming off is impossible. I mean, I see at least 3 skulls right there. I mean, what, 4 legs? Actually, it's kind of like 6 legs right there. This shows you how impossible this is. Like, what was it, 4 or 5 arms? Yeah, these are humans we're talking. Most of these players are human or human-like. with the exception of like Shiva and Goro in this version. Then another one I grew up with was Road Rash. I mean, people didn't go on bikes trying to knock them off. Like as you see here. Punching them off, and especially when you get to the cops trying to punch cops off. This is obviously the second one. I mean, people did not. This is another one I grew up with. It's a Genesis game. There's actually a later port on the PlayStation. But when it comes down to it is, and then I believe there was basically a successor to it done by an independent gamer or an independent game company that was done similar line to it. That was done. I forgot what the actual name of it was, but it was basically pretty much the same idea as Road Rash. He essentially did it to try to get EA to reproduce Road Rash on the different systems. And this shows you that it was that Road Rash is really not a violent, not considered violence when it comes to the actual socially, but it was just considered an enjoyable game. And there he has what he called club. And the fact is you're talking, are people clubbing others on the road? No. I've what it called, yes, I don't drive, but as being on disability. But the fact is I've seen plenty of bikers. I have never seen once someone clubbing someone hitting someone with a bike chain. None of this. Never in my life. And you would think that basically over me being 37 years old so far, you think just in number alone that I would be able, that the impact of these games, that I would be able to see one person. Yeah, now he has a chain now, but you would be able to see one person that would have done this over the time throughout the areas that I've seen. And no, this has never happened. And this is why we ignore the fact of why this happens. But what we need to do is we need to consider this is really more of an actual modern art form, because really, as I'll discuss tomorrow with it, I'll discuss why the actual art has really kind of evaded actual traditional art forms, because our actual traditional art forms have actually gone away, and we've actually kind of produced kind of garbage. But I'll actually explain more of that tomorrow in our post tomorrow. And but I'll explain how we actually started. This is actually the first traditional, as what we call an actual video game. What's actually the first, which is Pong. I mean, you look at Pong, and this is where we started. And you can see how far we've gone when we take Pong, and now we start looking at the trailer of MK11. This is a brand new game from NetherRealm Studios out in Chicago. And you just look at just how really fine-tuned it is in comparison, and you can see that this is basically the modern art form, and it basically allows them to be creative when it comes to the fatalities, when it comes to the actual gameplay, and it's something that's the modern art form, and we might not have the idea of such things as architecture because they've ruined that. We might not have the idea of such things as things like paintings and sculptures because they've ruined that. But we at least had this idea of gaming because they've essentially exploded on that, because this is something in which I think we have beautiful actual development in which people have actually showcased their actual artistic abilities and actually developed something that they're actually using the actual physical body form when you're seeing these internal injuries that they're showing. They're showing that they're showing that they know the anatomy that's happening, and actually the freeze forms when the actual stuff is coming out is actually something that's actually something beautiful artistically. If you're looking for the artistic form, it just happens to be within motion. And it's something that's actually quite unique compared to what other forms are, which is something that's nice. And if we look at that, we can see that basically this is kind of the modern art form. And culturally, if this is going to be the embraced modern art form, we shouldn't be bad mouthing it and saying that gamers are some type of lower level of people because they're not this high level of people buying the piece of canvas with one blue line down the center, which is garbage, embracing these structures of these god-awful sculptures, which are just basically look like trash in front of buildings, and basically these buildings which are just nothing but glass squares, which look horrible compared to the previous generations, which were actually pieces of architecture, and the previous sculptures which are actually meant something. And this is where we come from. And if this is going to be our modern art form, we need to embrace it. And because it's something actually that we've developed, it's actually come from something so simple. And these are actually real legitimate artists at the start. It actually comes from actual legitimate drawings and actually real legitimate art forms. We have that. We also have actual people doing the audio on the speaking parts, so it has its actual legitimate art form itself. It just happens to be a mobile art form that's really has not been able to get its respect. Now, it doesn't matter that we're finding that people that you're neoconservatives and that the left does not embrace it, because they view neoconservatives tend to want to have this narrow view of what should be acceptable because of censorship, and that you have your left that basically wants to embrace this modern art, which is garbage. This is basically something that should be considered part of our culture, and it's something that's we might not have much that actually works right in this day and age, but I would have to say that this is something that's actually improved greatly, and actually something that should be embraced. If you look at where we started, where we came from, this is something that's improved, and and it's something that luckily that government hasn't stepped in and tried to subsidize, and this is why we are where we are today. Government hasn't gotten in the middle of it and this is why games roughly have stayed at the same price from the start. Systems have actually stayed at the same price. Some cases gone up with it because now what we're doing is now we're adding actual internal storage, similar to computers, and they're functioning in many ways to computers themselves. So this is why the added on price points. But for the main function is we're talking they've stayed roughly about the same price plus the price of storage, and some more integrated features. And this is something that wouldn't have happened had government intervention occurred. We would probably still be in the dark ages playing Pong all day if government intervened, because government would have tried to save the actual crash back in the early 80s. And nothing good would have came about it, and we'd be still playing these games, and we wouldn't have progressed past that point. And gaming would be basically for those elite people who could actually afford these systems, and it wouldn't be for everyone. And it would be considered this thing similar like Pong, and it would be basically it would be games similar to the quality of Pong in nowadays system, but it would be a system to where we were basically only we would be paying easily several times what we're paying today for systems, and definitely several times what we're paying for games. You see what happened with the integration with the healthcare system, and this is what happened. Every time that the government intervenes, we get horrible results. Now, when we see what happens when they don't intervene, we get something as beautiful as what happens with like the early trailers of MK11. When they're not intervening, we get these excellent examples of games. And we can see that it's possible with it. And for the fact is you can say and government's idea to intervene is, we're checking to making sure everything's good. Well, we had those people. We had these different gamers that can actually play early releases to actually give us an idea of what's going on in the game. This is the whole idea. They act as our testers for the actual quality of the game. They're the ones testing quality to essentially tell us if it's good or not. And this is what allows us to essentially make our personal decisions of if we want to go after it or not. And it's something that works very, very well. And it's a system that, especially in nowadays gaming, works very well because you can have not just massive producers, but also independent producers produce games. And it allows both those people to essentially get their games out there to people that might not have heard of them through these influencers, by essentially just advertising them with them and just telling them just to play their game. And it can get exposed, and you can find a game that's maybe not the best well-known game, and it can get a huge fan showing and help that small producer become a big producer. And this is the way a free market works. Gaming is really more of a free market system as opposed to anything else. And this is something in which makes it a beautiful example of what the whole economy can be. And I think this is what kind of makes the whole gaming community something in which America itself should be making itself to be, not trying to essentially ignore and trying to make look bad as trying to make perceptions of them as they don't go outside and do anything else, and their lives are revolve around games. Games are just one aspect of these people's lives. They it just happens to be an interest of these people. Every person's going to have that. That's why they produce games in so many genres, because people are going to have many different interests. That's why they produce sporting games. They produce sporting games because there's people interested in sports. As we see, sports are a major seller as people play sports as well. So those who play sports are often interested in sporting games. This doesn't necessarily mean that they only sit inside playing sporting games. They often engage in playing sports as well. That doesn't necessarily mean that people who play fighting games engage in fighting. It just means that happens to be a certain release. They will have other certain things that they do for fun. Often you'll see this on certain YouTubers that do gaming. Often you'll see this on their channels. They'll show certain clips of what they're doing for fun. On certain ones won't with it, but a lot of them do. And these are just normal people. They're not people that are the people that are playing these quote-unquote violent video games are not people that are actually killing people. And this doesn't happen. And this is something that needs to be understood. And I think the more the fear happens to be that what we're talking about is we're talking about fear of the free market system. And this is where it's coming from: fear of the free market system, fear of an actual art form, and fear of the actual people themselves. Because we're even seeing when it comes to like memes on the internet, the left right now is stating that they want memes banned, not just memes against them, but memes in general. And we're seeing this with trying to copyright memes and then trying to ban memes. And the reason why is because they can't do it themselves. So what this is doing is essentially they've essentially made a war against libertarians, against conservatives, against gamers, because of their lack of creativity. And this is showing that there's some type of a kinship between these three groups that they have in common, that they can do that the left cannot. And it's through, I don't know if it's through a mental capacity or what, but we're talking that they can do things that that these groups are being able to do things that the left cannot. And it's something that has come about in recent time, and it's basically what we're seeing is gaming really is just this new breakout of, or relatively new breakout of, what can happen in a laissez-faire free market capitalist system. And I think the left completely fears that, because it's completely the opposite of a centralized regulated system, and it's culturally completely opposed to their system, because they see gamers as being from all groups and being completely accepting of people, and it's something that they can't essentially try to put any labels on. And this really because they essentially adapt the central label, and they won't accept things like these individual separatist labels at all, which is something unique. And this is where you find them being unable to penetrate through, which is something very, very special. Gamers don't see themselves as tied to a country. They don't see themselves tied to a race, tied to a human sexuality group, tied to a gender. They don't see themselves tied to any of these, which means they can't be essentially or religion or anything like that. They don't see themselves ability to be tied to any of that, which means they can't be separated. So if they view themselves as one specific group, then this becomes difficult. And that's what we're talking about. When we're talking about that, they become essentially an obstruction. And but from what we're talking about from neoconservatives essentially want to just blame them as essentially a reason to say they're the reason why there's violent video games, and neoconservatives tend to follow the left on a lot of things and want censorship, and we find them to basically want to have a blame game, to want this idea of getting rid of any type of freedom of expression for actual art, because they're just as much about regulation as the left is. And anytime you break around and break around regulation, they tend to get mad. So what we're talking about here is essentially we have a group that essentially has created their own little society that is essentially free of regulation and free of these industry standards and these social standards that have essentially created a lot of problems within every other group that they've been able to break apart. And that's something that makes them unique, and I would say that's why the hatred of them, and why they try to get brought down to a lower level, and why they try to make them think is not as sophisticated. But we're seeing them being more charitable than people on the left. We're seeing them be than these neocons. We're seeing them be peaceful. They're not committing violent acts. We're seeing them be for the most part advocate for peace with it. You'll find one or two of them that are kind of advocating for regulation with it now and then with it, but for the most part they don't. I'm not going to call out any specific ones, but that's kind of rude in this aspect. But this is more meant to be in general and trying to state the positive aspects of it. But you'll find all these things about the gaming community that they're actually looking for an actual peaceful things, and they're not looking to support ideas of collectivist type of mentalities, which is a real nice thing. And it's something that essentially kind of makes a little bit of a subgroup within society. Now, this can actually break out through other areas. This can essentially change the way we actually view society as a whole. And that's where we're getting into culture. And if this culture actually breaks out into legitimate forms of art, legitimate forms of architecture, actually political forms, it can actually essentially destroy what we see as neoconservatism and socialism, and actually get to legitimate forms of what we need, where we need to be, and viewing liberty as the essential focal point, getting out of people's lives and letting them just run as they see fit. And if you like, and that would be essentially our future. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and share this all the way around your social media. And I hope for those who I promised on Twitter about this thing a couple days ago, that this is up to your liking, everyone. and I will see you guys most likely tomorrow. I don't know if I can squeeze in another video today, because this is probably going to take a little bit longer for rendering. And bye, everyone.